Father Mateo Cárdenas took justice into his own hands when he confronted the 21 members of the cartel that was laundering money through church tithes. Mateo Cárdenas never wanted to be a priest. That's the first thing you have to understand. He grew up in a neighborhood on the outskirts of Guadalajara where water only came twice a week and the streets had no official names, just nicknames that people repeated until they became real. His father worked as a mechanic in a workshop that smelled of burnt oil and cheap cigarettes. His mother sold tamales in the mornings outside a primary school. Mateo was the oldest of 4 siblings, 3 younger sisters. When he was 17, his father had an accident at the workshop, a poorly secured crane. He was bedridden for almost 6 months and couldn't walk. The family began running out of money. Mateo dropped out of high school and started working wherever he could, washing cars, carrying loads at the market, helping on construction sites, but it was never enough. The girls were still in school and needed uniforms, notebooks, and shoes. One day, his mother told him to go talk to Father Ignacio at the neighborhood parish. Maybe there was work there. Mateo wasn't religious. He only went to Mass when his mother forced him, but he went because he had no choice. Father Ignacio was an elderly man with trembling hands and a very gentle voice. He offered him a job as a maintenance assistant, cleaning the church, fixing pews, painting walls, things like that. It didn't pay much, but it was steady. Mateo accepted, and that's how it all began. During the following months, Mateo worked at the parish from Monday to Saturday. While he worked, Father Ignacio would talk to him, telling him Bible stories not in a boring catechism way, but as if they were real stories about real people. He spoke to him about doubts, fear, and difficult decisions. Mateo began to listen, not necessarily because he believed, but because Father Ignacio never judged him. Never told him he was bad for dropping out of school or for not going to Mass. One day, Father Ignacio asked him if he had ever thought about the priesthood. Mateo laughed and said he wasn't cut out for that he barely even knew how to pray properly. But Father Ignacio told him something Mateo never forgot. Being a priest wasn't about knowing Latin or memorizing texts. It was about being close to people when they needed it most, accompanying them, listening to them. And that, he said, Mateo was already doing without realizing it. 2 years passed before Mateo agreed to enter the seminary. His father had recovered by then, his sisters were still studying, and Mateo felt that perhaps there he could find something. He wasn't sure what, but something. The seminary was hard, not so much because of the studies, though those were difficult too, but because Mateo never quite felt comfortable in that environment. There were seminarians from wealthy families who spoke differently and seemed to have everything figured out from the beginning. Mateo felt out of place, but he kept going, because he remembered what Father Ignacio had told him, being close to the people. He was ordained at 28. His mother cried during the ceremony, and so did his sisters. His father didn't say much, but he squeezed his shoulder very tightly. When it was all over, they sent him to a small parish in a town 2 hours from Guadalajara, San Miguel de los Haces, a place where almost everyone knew each other, and life revolved around the church and the central square. Mateo arrived eager to do things right, to help, to fulfill what he had promised. The first few months were calm. He celebrated Mass, visited the sick, baptized children, and heard confessions that were almost always the same. Gossip, couple fights, small lies, nothing serious. The people loved him. They called him Father Mateo, or simply Padrecito. They brought him food and fixed things in the parish house without him asking. But something began to change. At first, it was subtle. Mateo noticed that some men in town, young men who used to attend with their families, started missing Mass. Then, he began seeing new trucks parked outside houses that previously couldn't even afford to paint their walls. He heard rumors, comments people made in low voices, and stopped saying when he approached. One Sunday after Mass, an elderly woman approached him. Doña Celia, who had lived her whole life in San Miguel and knew everyone, told him to be careful, that things were changing, that new people were operating in the town and they weren't good people. Mateo asked what she meant, but she just shook her head and walked away. Mateo started paying closer attention and saw things he hadn't noticed before, or perhaps hadn't wanted to notice. Some Sundays, men he had never seen arrived. They sat in the back. They dressed too well for a town like San Miguel. They left large bills in the collection baskets, 500s and 1000s. And always stared directly at Mateo as the basket passed, as if waiting for something. One day after Mass, one of those men waited until everyone had left. He approached Mateo, introduced himself as Ruben, and said he really liked the way he celebrated Mass, that it was very inspiring. He and his partners wanted to support the parish. They needed to make improvements, fix the roof, buy new pews. Mateo thanked him but said that for now they didn't need anything urgent. Ruben smiled and told him not to worry, that they wanted to help anyway, that it was important to them, and then left. Mateo felt something strange, an unease he couldn't quite explain. In the following weeks, Ruben and the other men began attending more often, not just on Sundays, during the week too, leaving large donations. They told Mateo they wanted to organize events, patron saint festivals, processions, and that they would pay for everything. Mateo would thank them, but say the parish had its own ways of organizing and that it wasn't necessary. But they insisted, and the townspeople started talking. Some said how wonderful it was that generous people were supporting the church. Others said nothing, but Mateo could see in their faces that they knew something he didn't. One night, close to 11 p.m., there was a knock at the parish house door. Mateo opened it and saw a young man he didn't know. He was nervous and sweating. He said he needed to speak with him urgently. Mateo let him in. The young man's name was David. He was 23. He told Mateo he worked for Ruben and his people. At first, he thought it was normal work, carrying packages, guarding warehouses, but later he realized what it really was. He said the money they were donating to the church wasn't clean. They were using the parish to launder what they earned from other activities. Without knowing it, the church was becoming part of something very big and very dangerous. David asked Mateo to be careful, not to accept any more money, and warned that if Ruben found out Mateo knew something, things could turn bad. Then he left. Mateo didn't sleep that night. He tossed and turned, thinking about the donations, the stares, the comments, and what David had told him. He understood that he was involved in something he didn't know how to escape. The next day, he tried to call the bishop and explain the situation. The bishop told him to stay calm. If he wasn't sure of anything, it was better not to make accusations. If the donations stopped, that was fine, but there was no need to look for problems where there might not be any. Mateo hung up, feeling completely alone. He decided to stop accepting the large donations. The next time Ruben arrived with an envelope full of bills, Mateo thanked him, but said it was no longer necessary. The parish was fine as it was. Ruben stared at him, smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. He said it was okay, whatever he wanted, but that if he ever needed anything, he was there. 3 weeks passed. 3 weeks in which Ruben and his people stopped coming to Mass. Mateo thought maybe they had understood and left. He was wrong. One afternoon, there was a knock at the door. It was Doña Celia, crying. She told him that David, the young man who had come to talk to him, had disappeared. He hadn't returned home in 2 days, and his mother was desperate. Mateo felt a cold knot in his stomach. He told her he would ask around and see what he could do, but he did nothing, because he was afraid and didn't know what to do. They found David 4 days later in an empty lot on the outskirts of town. Mateo went to the wake. David's mother wouldn't stop crying. No one spoke about how it happened, but everyone knew. Mateo knew too, and he felt guilty because David had come to him and he had done nothing to protect him. That night, Mateo prayed. He prayed for real, not the prayers he repeated from memory, but something deeper. He asked God to tell him what to do, to give him a sign, to help him understand. But no clear answer came. The following days were strange. Ruben reappeared at Mass and sat in the front row. This time, he stared at Mateo the entire time, as if saying something without words, reminding him that they were still there and hadn't gone anywhere. Mateo began to feel that something had to change, that he couldn't continue like this, but he didn't know exactly what to do. He spoke with some trusted parishioners and asked what they knew about Ruben and his people. Most didn't want to talk. They were afraid, but an older man, Don Thomas, told him what he knew. Ruben worked for outsiders using San Miguel as a transit point. They had several local young men working for them, paid well. But if anyone stepped out of line or talked too much, things ended very badly. Several businesses in town were already being used to launder money. The grocery store, the mechanic shop, and now the church. Mateo asked why no one reported them. Don Thomas gave a bitter laugh and said the town police were bought off. So was the mayor. There was no one to turn to. People were just trying to survive and stay out of trouble. Before you continue listening to this story, I want to ask you something. If you're enjoying what you're hearing, please subscribe to the channel, give it a like, and leave a comment telling me what you think. Stories like this need to reach more people, and your support makes that possible. Now, let's continue. Mateo realized he was completely alone. He couldn't trust the authorities, the bishop wouldn't help, the townspeople were terrified, and Ruben and his people weren't going to stop. So Mateo began to change. It wasn't sudden, it was slow, almost imperceptible at first. He stopped sleeping well. He stopped smiling the way he used to. He began observing everything more carefully, paying attention to details he once ignored, listening to conversations he once didn't care about. He started asking himself questions he had never asked before. Was he trying to stay silent when he knew something evil was happening? Did being a priest mean only praying and saying Mass? Or did it also mean protecting the people? Did God expect him to do something, or just accept things as they were? He found no clear answers, but something inside him began to harden. One Sunday after Mass, Ruben approached him again. This time, he wasn't smiling. He said they needed to talk, that there were things to resolve. Mateo replied there was nothing to talk about. Ruben stepped closer and spoke quietly. Mateo didn't understand how things worked now. In San Miguel, there was a new order. You were either with them or against them, and being against them was not a good idea. Mateo looked him in the eyes and said he wasn't afraid. It was a lie. He was terrified, but something in him refused to show it. Ruben laughed, said he would see, and left. That night, Mateo didn't sleep at the parish house. He stayed at Doña Celia's. She didn't ask why. She just made him tea and gave him a room. The next morning, when he returned to the parish house, he found the door open. They had broken in. They took nothing but left everything in disarray. Papers scattered, drawers open, as if to say, we can enter whenever we want. Mateo knew things were going to get worse, and he was right. The following days were a nightmare. Someone painted threats on the church walls, messages Mateo had to clean before anyone saw them. They left notes under the door with horrible things, naming his mother and sisters, saying they knew where they lived, that they knew everything about him. Mateo called his family and told them to be careful, not to go out alone, to let him know if they saw anything strange. His mother asked what was happening. He lied and said it was nothing serious, just precautions. But inside he was devastated. He knew he had put the people he loved most in danger. And for what? For refusing dirty money, for trying to do the right thing. He began to wonder if it had been worth it, if it wouldn't have been better to stay quiet and let things continue. But it was already too late. One night, Mateo was alone in the church, organizing things for the next day's Mass, when he heard someone enter. He turned around. Two men he had never seen, young, with hard faces, closed the door behind them. One said Ruben was tired of his nonsense and that things needed to be made clear once and for all. The other approached. Mateo stepped back and asked what they wanted. The man smiled and said they had only come to deliver a message. What happened next, Mateo never told in full detail, but they beat him, not too badly, just enough so he would know they could do much worse. They left him lying on the church floor among the pews and walked away laughing. Mateo stayed there, he doesn't know how long, feeling the pain, the humiliation, and something else he couldn't name. When he finally got up and looked at himself in the sacristy bathroom mirror, he saw his swollen face and split lip, and he saw someone he no longer fully recognized. Something broke inside Mateo that night, something that perhaps could never be repaired. The following days were confusing. He continued celebrating Mass, visiting the sick, doing everything a priest was supposed to do. But inside, everything had changed. He no longer prayed the same way. He no longer spoke the same way. People noticed. They asked if he was okay. He said yes, but it wasn't true. Mateo started doing things he had never done before. He began investigating, asking questions, gathering information about Ruben and his people, where they lived, when they moved, who they talked to, who worked for them. He didn't know exactly why he was collecting the information. He just felt he needed to know. He spoke with more people in town, people who had lost someone because of Ruben's group, people who were afraid but also angry. And Mateo understood he wasn't the only one who wanted change. Don Tomas told him that Ruben and his men met from time to time in an old house on the outskirts of town. It had once belonged to a rancher who left years ago. That's where they did their accounting, stored things, and planned their operations. Mateo asked how he knew. Don Tomas said his nephew worked for them and told him things. The nephew wanted out but was afraid. Mateo asked if he could speak with him. Don Tomas said he would try. 2 days later, Don Tomas's nephew came to see Mateo. His name was Oscar. He was 25 and looked exhausted. He told Mateo everything he knew, how they operated, how many there were, who the most dangerous ones were, where they kept the money, how they moved it. Mateo listened and took mental notes. Oscar asked why he wanted to know. Mateo didn't know what to answer because he wasn't sure himself. Before leaving, Oscar told him Ruben was planning something big. They were bringing people from outside and expanding operations across the entire region with San Miguel as the center. If anything was going to be done, it had to be soon. Afterward, it would be impossible. Mateo spent that night awake, turning everything over in his mind. He knew what he was thinking was wrong, that it went against everything he had been taught and everything he himself had preached. But he also knew that if he did nothing, the people of San Miguel would keep suffering and dying, and no one else was going to do anything about it. So Mateo made a decision that changed him forever. I'm not going to say exactly what he did, because I can't. It's not right to glorify those things. But what I can say is that Mateo stopped being just a priest. The first thing that happened was that one of Ruben's men disappeared. A guy who called himself El Chino, one of the most violent, the one people feared most. One day, he simply didn't return. Ruben and the others searched for him, asked around, but no one knew anything. They thought he had gone to another group or betrayed them, but that wasn't it. 2 weeks later, another man disappeared. His name was Rogelio. He was the one who handled the money and kept the books. He also vanished without a trace. Now Ruben was worried. He started suspecting people, but he never suspected Mateo. After all, who would suspect a priest? Mateo continued celebrating Mass, hearing confessions, being Father Mateo to everyone. But at night, he became someone else, a person who had crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed. The townspeople began to notice that things were changing. Ruben's men were seen less often. They seemed nervous. Some said it was rival groups fighting over territory. Others didn't know what to think. Mateo never said a word, not even to those he trusted most, because he knew that if anyone found out, everything would collapse. Ruben became paranoid and stopped trusting his own people. He started accusing them. There were internal fights and real betrayals because no one knew who to trust anymore. The group began to fall apart from within, and Mateo simply watched and waited. One day Ruben came looking for Mateo at the church. He burst in, screaming that someone was betraying him, that someone was taking his people. Mateo listened calmly and asked what he wanted him to do. Ruben told him to pray that they find the person responsible. Mateo said he would pray, but he didn't pray for that. The night Ruben disappeared, no one saw it coming. He had left the meeting house alone in his truck. They found the truck 2 days later, abandoned on a dirt road. But Ruben was never found. After that, the group completely fell apart. Those who remained left town, some out of fear, others because there was no longer any reason to stay. San Miguel slowly returned to what it had been before, a quiet town where not much happened. People said it was a miracle, that God had heard their prayers and cleaned the town of those bad people. Mateo heard those comments and said nothing. He just nodded and smiled slightly. But inside, he knew the truth, and he carried that truth every day, every night, every time he stood before the altar and raised a host. What no one knew was that it hadn't stopped with Ruben and his closest men. Mateo continued. He found others, those who worked in the city, those who moved the money elsewhere, those who had given the orders to harm people in the town, one by one. For months, Oscar, Don Tomas's nephew, had helped him without fully understanding what he was doing. He gave him information, addresses, schedules. He thought Mateo was passing it to real authorities. He didn't know Mateo himself was acting, until one night he saw something he shouldn't have. He saw Mateo leaving a house in Guadalajara where one of the organization's important contacts lived. He saw him walk slowly to his car, remove a pair of gloves, and take a deep breath before driving away. Oscar froze. When Mateo left, he entered the house and found what he expected. The man was there, but no longer alive. Oscar ran, vomited in the street, went home shaking, and didn't sleep all night, wondering what to do. The next day, he went to the parish and found Mateo in the sacristy preparing for Mass. He said they needed to talk. Mateo knew immediately what it was about. They went to the parish house. Oscar asked him directly, "Was it you?" Mateo didn't deny it. He just looked at him. Oscar started shouting, calling him crazy, saying how could he do that as a priest, that it was wrong no matter who those people were, that he had no right. Mateo listened without interrupting. When Oscar finished, breathing heavily, Mateo spoke. He said Oscar was right, it was wrong, and he knew it. But someone had to do it. No one else was going to protect the people of the town. Not the police, not the government, not the church. Oscar said that didn't justify it. Mateo agreed. He wasn't looking for justification. He would carry it for the rest of his life. But if he had to decide again, he would probably do the same. Oscar asked how many there had been. After a pause, Mateo answered, 21. Until that moment. Oscar sat down, head in his hands, and asked what would happen now. Mateo said it was up to him. If he wanted to report him, it was his right. He wouldn't stop him or threaten him. Oscar stayed silent for a long time. Then he said something Mateo didn't expect. He wasn't going to say anything, not because he agreed, but because he didn't want the whole town to know the truth. The people needed to believe it had been the work of God. They needed that peace of mind. If they found out a priest had done it, it would destroy something important. But he told Mateo he had to leave San Miguel. He couldn't stay there as if nothing had happened. Mateo said he would think about it. 3 months passed. Mateo stayed in San Miguel and continued his work, but he was no longer the same. People noticed he was quieter, more distant. His masses no longer had the same energy. Some parishioners asked if he was sick. He said he was just tired and needed rest. One day, a letter arrived from the bishopric. They were transferring him to another, even smaller parish in the mountains. They said it was an opportunity to renew himself, to be closer to nature and to God. Mateo knew it had been Oscar. He had spoken to someone and pulled strings without revealing the full truth, to get him out of San Miguel without raising suspicions. The day Mateo left town, there was a farewell mass. Many people came. They thanked him for everything. They said they would miss him, that he had been a good priest and had taken care of them. Mateo listened and felt empty inside, because he knew he didn't deserve their gratitude. They had no idea who he really was. Doña Celia gave him a long hug before he boarded the bus. She whispered in his ear that God knew what he had done and that perhaps, one day, he would forgive him. Mateo didn't know if she knew something or was just being kind. He went to his new destination, a place where no one knew him, where he could start over, or at least try. But things didn't get better. The new parish was more isolated and quieter. There were no problems like in San Miguel. Everything was routine and predictable. Mateo thought it would help him find peace, but it didn't. He started having trouble sleeping. He saw faces in his dreams, the faces of the people he had eliminated. He heard voices. Sometimes he woke up screaming in the middle of the night. The parishioners began to worry. They said Father Mateo didn't look well and perhaps needed to see a doctor. Mateo started drinking. Not much, just enough to sleep a few hours. He hid it well. No one noticed, or at least no one said anything. One day, during Mass, he blanked out in the middle of the homily. He stood there in front of everyone, unable to speak. The people waited. He tried to continue, but couldn't. He left the church and walked into the mountains. He stayed there for hours. When he returned, it was already dark. The bishop called him in and said he was worried. He asked if he needed time off. Mateo said he was fine, that he'd just had a bad day. The bishop didn't seem convinced, but didn't push. Things worsened when Mateo started hearing news that some of the groups Ruben had worked with were returning to the region. Not to San Miguel specifically, but nearby. They had found new ways to operate and new people. And Mateo felt something he hadn't felt in months, the need to act. He started investigating again, asking questions, gathering information. He didn't know exactly why. He only knew he couldn't stay still while it was happening. One night, he drove 3 hours to a nearby city. He had located one of the new operators, a man recruiting young boys for illegal work. Mateo followed him for days, learned his routines, knew where he lived and when he was alone. One night, he acted. After that, Mateo knew there was no turning back. This wasn't going to end. Something inside him had broken permanently, and he wouldn't be able to stop even if he wanted to. He began traveling more often, always with excuses, visiting family, medical appointments, spiritual retreats. The The parishioners suspected nothing, but Mateo was living a double life. By day, he was Father Mateo, saying Mass, hearing confessions, baptizing, doing everything expected of a priest. By night, he was someone else, seeking out specific people who caused harm and eliminating them. Not all were from the original group. Some weren't even connected, but they all shared one thing. They hurt innocent people and took advantage of the weakest. Mateo had decided he would stop them. He knew it was wrong. He knew it every time he looked in the mirror, every time he raised the host during Mass, every time someone came to confess, because his own sins were far worse than anything they confessed. And he had no one to confess to. One day, a young priest arrived to help him. He was newly ordained and named Father Luis. He was enthusiastic and full of energy. He truly believed in what he did and reminded Mateo of how he himself had once been. Father Luis began noticing things. Mateo's frequent absences, his tiredness, the nights he didn't sleep at the parish house. He asked if everything was all right. Mateo said yes, he was just going through a difficult time. But Father Luis insisted. They could support each other. He didn't have to carry everything alone. Mateo appreciated it, but couldn't tell him the truth. No one could know. One day, Father Luis found a folder in Mateo's car, papers with information about people, addresses, photos, schedules. He asked what it was. Mateo said it was information about pastoral visits. Father Luis seemed to accept it, but Mateo noticed he no longer looked at him the same way. Father Luis's suspicions grew when he noticed coincidences. Whenever Mateo was away, news appeared of disappearances in nearby cities. People with criminal records who were wanted by the law. He didn't want to believe what he was thinking. It was impossible, ridiculous. But the coincidences were too many. One night, he followed Mateo. He saw him leave late in his car and followed at a distance. Mateo drove to a city 2 hours away, parked near a bar, and waited. Father Luis parked far away and watched. He saw a man leave the bar and Mateo follow him on foot. They disappeared into a dark street. He waited. Half an hour later, he saw Mateo come out alone, looking upset and nervous. He got in his car and left. Father Luis was paralyzed. He didn't know whether to check the street or follow Mateo. He went to the street and searched with his phone light. He found nothing. Maybe he was wrong, but he couldn't shake the doubt. The next morning at breakfast, he asked Mateo where he had been the night before. Mateo said he hadn't gone out. He had been in his room. Father Luis knew he was lying and told him he had seen him and followed him. Mateo stayed silent and didn't deny it. Father Luis asked what he was doing. Mateo didn't answer. He got up and went to his room. Father Luis didn't know what to do. He considered talking to the bishop, but had no real proof, only suspicions. Accusing a priest of something like that without evidence would be terrible. He decided to confront Mateo directly. That night, he knocked on his door. Mateo opened it. Father Luis entered and said they needed to talk seriously. He needed to know what was happening. Mateo closed the door, sat on the bed, and after a long silence, began to speak. He told him everything, from San Miguel, from Ruben, from David, from the night they beat him in the church, from the decision he made. He told him about the 21 and about those who came after. He explained how he couldn't stop because every time he tried, he saw more news of people suffering and felt he had to act. Father Luis listened without interrupting. When Mateo finished, he remained silent for a very long time. Then he asked how he could continue being a priest, knowing what he had done. Mateo said he didn't know. Maybe he shouldn't, but he didn't know how to do anything else. At least as a priest, he could still help some people in a normal way, give them comfort, listen to them, even if he himself had none. Father Luis told him he had to stop. Even if those people were criminals, he had no right. This was destroying him. Mateo said he knew, but he didn't know how to stop. Every time he tried, he started again. Father Luis asked if he had thought about turning himself in and confessing everything to the authorities. Mateo said yes, but if he did, they would probably lynch him before he reached trial, and his family would suffer. His mother would find out everything, and his sisters would carry the shame. Father Luis didn't know what else to say. He asked Mateo to at least promise not to do it again. Mateo promised nothing. He only asked Father Luis not to say anything and to give him time to think. Father Luis agreed reluctantly, but warned that if he suspected anything again, he would have to speak. He couldn't be an accomplice. The following days were very tense. Father Luis watched Mateo constantly. Mateo knew it. He could no longer move freely. He couldn't leave without being asked where he was going. He began to feel trapped, as if the walls were closing in. One night, he received a call from Oscar, who said they needed to talk urgently. He couldn't say more over the phone. They had to meet in person. Mateo drove to San Miguel. They met at Don Tomas's house. Oscar looked worried. He said people from outside had been asking about him. Serious, dangerous people, investigating what really happened with Ruben's group. Someone suspected it hadn't been rival groups. If they kept digging, they would eventually discover the truth. He told Mateo he had to leave Mexico. It was the only way to be safe. Mateo asked how, where, and with what money. Oscar said Don Tomas and other people in town had collected some money. It wasn't much, but enough to cross the border and start over on the other side. Mateo didn't know what to say. He sat there thinking about his mother, his sisters, the parish, Father Luis, everything he had done and everything he was leaving behind. Oscar said he had to decide quickly. The people asking questions wouldn't take long to find him. Mateo agreed to go, but said he needed a few days to arrange everything and say goodbye without raising suspicions. He returned to the parish. Father Luis noticed something had changed and asked what was happening. Mateo said he had decided to take some time off. He would ask the bishop for leave to reflect. Father Luis seemed relieved and said it was probably what he needed. Mateo spoke with the bishop, saying he was going through a spiritual crisis and needed time in silence to reconnect with his faith. The bishop granted him 6 months' leave and recommended a monastery, but Mateo had no intention of going there. In the days before leaving, Mateo arranged everything. He wrote letters, one for his mother, one for his sisters, one for Father Luis, and left them to be found later. He also wrote a complete confession, everything he had done, with names, dates, and places, not for publication, but as a record. He sealed it in an envelope and gave it to Don Tomas. He told him that if anything happened to him, he should open it, otherwise burn it unopened after 10 years. Don Tomas accepted without asking questions. The night before he left, Mateo celebrated his last Mass. The church was full. The people didn't know it was the last one. For them, it was a normal Mass. Mateo looked at all those familiar faces, people who trusted him and saw him as a man of God. If they knew the truth, they would probably hate him. Or perhaps not. Maybe some would understand, but Mateo would never know. He finished the Mass and said goodbye to everyone who approached. He thanked them. Some said they would miss him during his retreat and would pray for him. Mateo smiled and thanked them. That night, he didn't sleep. He stayed awake until dawn, staring at the ceiling of his room, thinking about the entire path he had walked. It had all started with good intentions, the desire to help, to be close to people, to do something good, and had ended with 23 people who were no longer here because Mateo had decided the world would be better without them. Perhaps he was right, perhaps not. That question no longer had an answer. At dawn he got up, put on normal clothes, jeans, a shirt, a jacket. He no longer dressed as a priest. He packed a small suitcase, clothes, some papers, a photo of his family. Before leaving, he went to the church one last time. He knelt before the altar and tried to pray, but the words wouldn't come. He stayed there in silence for a while, then stood up, looked around, and left. Oscar was waiting for him at the edge of town. He drove him to Guadalajara. From there, Mateo took a bus north toward the border. The journey was long. He didn't talk much with the other passengers. He just looked out the window as the landscapes, towns, and cities passed by. Everything looked different now, as if he were seeing Mexico for the last time. He crossed the border with the help of a coyote Don Tomas had contacted. It wasn't easy. 2 days walking through the desert, hiding, afraid, but he finally made it to the other side. He settled in a small city in Texas. He found work in construction and rented a room in an old house. He began a completely new life. He was no longer Father Mateo. He was just Mateo, another immigrant trying to survive. The first months were very hard. Not so much because of the work or money, but because of the loneliness. He knew no one. He spoke to no one. He spent his days working and his nights in that small room, staring at the ceiling. He missed Mexico, his family, and even the church. He missed saying Mass, hearing confessions, feeling useful. But he knew he could never go back. One day, he was watching Spanish-language news on his phone and saw a report about San Miguel de los Aces. They said the town had been recognized as one of the safest places in Jalisco. Crime had dropped almost to zero. It was an example of how communities could recover. Mateo read the whole report. There were interviews with townspeople. Doña Celia said it was thanks to prayers. Don Tomas said it was because the people had united. The new priest said it was a miracle from God. No one mentioned Mateo. No one mentioned what had really happened. And perhaps that was fine. Perhaps it was better that people believed it had been divine work, that their prayers had been answered, that good had triumphed over evil, even though the truth was much more complicated. Mateo closed the report, turned off the phone, and sat in his room thinking about everything. He never knew whether what he did was right or wrong. He never found that clear answer. The only thing he knew was that in that moment, he felt he had no other choice. Someone had to do something, and that someone ended up being him. He carried the consequences of those decisions every single day, in every nightmare, in every moment of silence, in every glance at his reflection where he no longer fully recognized the person looking back. There were days when he thought about turning himself in, returning to Mexico, confessing everything and facing whatever came. But he always stopped when he thought of his mother and sisters and how it would affect them. So he continued living this life that wasn't really a life, just an existence. He worked, ate, slept, and repeated it the next day. Sometimes he thought about Father Luis and wondered if he had found the letters and what he had done with the information. He hoped he had burned them and decided to keep the secret for everyone's sake. Sometimes he thought about David, the young man who had come to warn him that night, who had tried to do the right thing and paid for it with his life. Mateo wondered what would have happened if he had acted differently, if he had called someone or reported it. Maybe David would still be alive. Maybe everything would have been different. But there was no way to know. There was no way to change the past, only to live with it. The years passed. Mateo stayed in that small city. He changed jobs several times. He met some people but never made close friends. He had co-workers he could talk with about unimportant things, the weather, work, sports, things that didn't require revealing anything personal. He never entered a church again, not even as a visitor. He couldn't. Every time he passed near one, he felt something in his chest that made him look away, as if the walls themselves knew who he was and what he had done. One afternoon, walking home, he passed a small church. He stopped and looked at the entrance. It had been years since he had gone inside one, years since he had truly prayed. But something pushed him to enter. Inside, he was alone. Only a few candles were lit at the front. Mateo walked slowly, sat in one of the back pews, looked at the altar, and felt the full weight of all those years fall upon him. He didn't pray. He no longer knew how, and he didn't know if he had the right. He just sat there in silence, thinking about everything. His mother, his sisters, Father Ignacio, who had given him the chance to become a priest, David, Ruben, all the others, every decision he had made, and every consequence that followed. There was no revelation, no answers, no peace, just silence. And perhaps, for now, that was enough. He got up after a while, left the church, and continued walking home as the sun set behind the buildings. Mateo Cárdenas' story didn't have a happy ending. It didn't have a sad ending either. It just had a normal ending. The ending of a man who made decisions that cannot be undone, who tried to do justice in his own way, even though that justice came at a terribly high cost, and who lived with the consequences of those acts every day of his life. There is no clear moral. There is no simple lesson. There is only the story of a man who began wanting to help and ended up becoming something he never wanted to be, and who had to learn to live with that. If you made it this far, it's because this story caught you in some way, and that means something. Stories about real people facing impossible decisions need to be told. They need to be heard. So if you liked what you just heard, subscribe to the channel, share this video, and above all, stay for the next one, because we're going to hear another story that will leave you thinking. Click on the video that's appearing on your screen now. You're going to like it.